Look at me, child. Come closer to the fire, because the story I'm about to tell you will chew your bones deeper than any winter you've ever known. Forget the snow you play in. Forget the frost on your window. This is not that kind of cold. This is a predator that waits for you to make one single mistake. It was minus 59 degrees Celsius. You probably can't even imagine what that means, can you? At that temperature, the air isn't just air anymore, it's a solid weight. Think about your breath for a second. When you breathe out in a cold morning, you see a little mist, right? But in this story, the moment the breath leaves your lips, it turns into ice. Instantly, you can actually hear it falling to the ground. A tiny, sharp tinkle, like broken glass hitting the snow. That is the sound of your own life shattering in the air. Now, there was a man in this white desert. He wasn't like you or me. He didn't listen to stories, and he didn't believe in the soul of the woods. He was a man of facts. He had a map in his pocket and a watch on his wrist. He thought he could calculate his way through the mouth of hell. He remembered what the old man from the creek told him. The old man had looked him in the eye, just like I'm looking at you, and said, "No man should travel alone in the deep cold." But the man just laughed. He thought the old man was weak. He thought being smart was better than being careful. He thought his logic was a shield that could stop the frost. He was a master of the world, or so he believed. But behind him, trailing in his shadows, was a dog, a big, gray wolf dog. Now, listen to me. The dog didn't have a map. The dog didn't have a watch. But the dog had something the man had forgotten. It had a memory in its blood. It felt the cold reaching through its fur, trying to touch its very heart. The dog's soul was screaming one word, over and over: fire. The man looked at the sky and saw a path. The dog looked at the man and saw a grave. The man trusted the numbers. The dog trusted the fear. Everything was going exactly as the man planned. He was fast. He was strong. He was certain, until he stepped on a patch of snow that looked just like the rest. Crack! The sound was small, like a dry twig breaking. But in that silence, it sounded like a death sentence. Stay still. Listen to that sound, the crack. It's the sound of the world opening up to swallow you whole. The man stood there frozen, as the icy water rushed into his boots. He wasn't deep in the river, only up to his knees. But at minus 59 degrees Celsius, it doesn't matter if it's an inch or an ocean. Water is the kiss of death. His feet were soaked. His blood began to pull away from his skin, retreating to his heart like a frightened animal. Now, a wise man would have felt a cold hand squeeze his soul. A wise man would have panicked just enough to be fast. But our man, he was still calm. He was still the master of logic. He sat down on a snow-covered log and began to work. He knew the science. If your feet are wet at this temperature, you have a few minutes before they turn into blocks of ice. He needed a fire. He didn't want a fire, he required one. He began to gather dry twigs, his fingers moving with the precision of a clock. He was proud of himself. He thought, the old man was wrong. I had an accident, and I am solving it. He built a small nest of grass and birch bark. He struck a match. The flame was tiny, a flickering orange ghost in a kingdom of white. He fed it, 1 twig, 2 twigs. He built the fire under a large, beautiful spruce tree. It was a perfect spot. The branches stayed thick and low, protecting his little flame from the wind. The fire grew. It started to crackle, dancing and biting at the cold. The man began to untie his frozen laces. He was winning. He looked at the dog, who was watching him with those strange, golden eyes. The man wanted to laugh at the dog. He wanted to say, "See, I don't need instinct. I have matches." But listen to me, child. Nature doesn't argue with you. Nature just waits for you to forget the simplest law of the world. The tree above the man was heavy. It had been holding months of snow on its wide, flat branches. And the fire was warm. The heat rose up, invisible and soft, touching the underside of those branches. The man was busy with his boots. He didn't see the snow starting to soften. He didn't see the white weight shifting. Then there was no sound at all, just a sudden, massive weight. A giant, cold hand fell from the sky. The snow from the tree tumbled down, burying the man, the wood, and the flame. In one heartbeat, the world went from orange to gray. The fire was dead. The smoke drifted away like a soul leaving a body. The man looked at the pile of snow where his life had been burning. The silence came back, louder than a thunderstorm. He realized he had made a mistake that logic couldn't fix. For the first time, his fingers didn't feel like fingers. They felt like heavy, cold pieces of iron. He reached for his matches, but his hands wouldn't close. The cold was no longer outside of him. It was inside. And the dog just sat there waiting for a master who knew how to stay warm. That is nothing compared to what happened next under that silent, frozen tree. The man stared at the gray patch of ash where his life had just been smothered. He tried to stand, but his feet were no longer his. They were dead weights, like two stones tied to his legs. He reached for his pocket, for the remaining matches, but his fingers, they were like frozen sausages. No feeling, no movement, just useless sticks of flesh. He had to use the heels of his hands to clump the matches together. He struck them all at once, 70 sulfur matches against his leg. A sudden, brilliant flare of fire erupted. It smelled of burning sulfur and hope. But as the flame licked his palms, he smelled something else. He smelled burning flesh. His own skin was smoking, charring in the heat, and yet he felt nothing. He was so cold that the fire felt like a distant memory, not a burning pain. His hands shook, and the bundle of burning matches fell into the snow. Thefts, darkness again. The dog watched him. It sat just out of reach, its ears cocked, waiting for the smell of a real fire. The man looked at the dog, and a dark, terrible thought crawled into his mind. He remembered a story of a man who killed an animal to crawl inside its warm carcass to survive. He called to the dog, but the dog heard the murder in his voice. It heard the hollow, desperate rattle of a dying animal, not the command of a master. The dog backed away into the shadows. The man tried to run, to beat the blood back into his limbs. He ran for 100 yards, flapping his useless arms like a broken bird. But you can't run away from the air itself. He fell into the snow, and this time, he didn't try to get up. He felt a strange, warm drowsiness stealing over him. He thought, I am freezing to death. It isn't so bad. It's like falling asleep. He saw the old man from Sulphur Creek in his mind. He saw the old man sitting by a warm stove, smoking a pipe. The man whispered into the silence, You were right, old man. You were right. His eyes closed. The cold was no longer his enemy. It was his blanket. The dog waited for a long time. It waited for the man to move, to make a sound, to bring the fire back. But the man was just a white mound in the clearing now. The dog caught the scent of death, that strange, cold smell that no map can explain. It turned its head toward the stars and let out a long, low howl. Then it turned away. It began to trot down the trail toward the camp it knew was there. The dog moved toward the other humans, toward the other fires, because the dog knew how to survive. And the man was finally part of the silence. Now look at your own life. We have our GPS, our heaters, and our maps. We think we have conquered the wild. But nature is patient. It is much older than our pride. And never, ever forget, the world is much older than your pride. I wonder how many of us are as smart as we think we are.